Hello, everyone. Today we're reading Ezekiel chapters 5 through 8. Here we see the continuation of God warning Israel of the coming judgment. After Ezekiel had spent all that time lying on his side, in chapter 5, God tells Ezekiel to use a sword and shave his head and beard and divide the hair into 3 even parts, representing the people of Israel. These 3 parts were then burned, cut up, and scattered to the wind. Then he was to take a tiny number of them and keep them in his outer skirt, representing the remnant that would be saved. But even that small bundle wasn't safe. Some of them were going to be burned as well. So the entire nation was going to be reduced to just a handful of people. So really a terrifying picture. God goes on in verse 5 to explain the reason for the judgment, that he set Jerusalem up apart as an example to the nations around her, and they'd ignored God's laws and been more disobedient than the nations around them. So the result of their destruction would cause the nations to reproach them, to be in astonishment over what was going to happen. He talked about things that were going to happen, what were going to be going on: cannibalism, famine, and death by the sword. He also talks about wild beasts and pestilence. God's anger would be poured out because of their sins. In chapter 6, God calls out their idolatry. He told Ezekiel to prophesy against the mountains, their high places where they had made altars or shrines. God was going to destroy the high places and bring the sword, and the bones of the dead would be all around. This would have defiled the high places, so those places were no longer acceptable for any kind of religious activity. And then again, God promised he would leave a remnant. Throughout the chapter, God is repeating that these things are all happening. As a result, they will know that I am Lord. I am the Lord. In chapter 7, the end has come. Judgment is near. Verse 2 says to the 4 corners. So it's not just a small area that this is going to happen, but the whole nation would experience the destruction. There was a disaster, a singular disaster was coming, and they were about to pay for their abominations. Again, the statement, then you will know I am the Lord, is repeated. Often, it seems like with Nineveh or Israel has done this, they were given a time to repent, and they humbled themselves and repented, and God, he then relented. This chapter really doesn't sound like that is an option. It's past that time. In verse 16 through 19, the initial survivors who escaped to the mountains will mourn, wear sackcloths, shave their heads. It doesn't really sound like it's because they are repenting, but because this is the humiliated, destitute place that they find themselves in. The last part of the chapter, the remaining inhabitants are robbed of their goods. Verse 23 says to make a chain, so most likely that refers to some slavery. Foreigners will live in their houses, just all-out disaster. And then one thing that stood out to me at the end of verse 9 there, God shares another name that he will be known by. He'll be known by the Lord who strikes. In chapter 8, Ezekiel sees a vision of God, and then he carries him by a lock of his hair to the temple in Jerusalem. So I guess his hair had grown back by then. And shows him the abominations and idols that were in the temple. Ezekiel is shown specifics of the type of idol worship that is going on, even to seeing and recognizing some of the individuals that were participating. So it sounds like those names may have been thought highly of from respectable families, but clearly they were not doing things right. The chapter ends with God saying he will not have pity. Even though they cry in a loud voice in his ear, he won't hear them.